Okay, we're going to continue to look at this thesis we have, that the gospel has a relation to everything. And in particular, what we're going to look at tonight is the fourth gospel. And I told Cher earlier this afternoon around 2 o'clock, I said, God, the labor pains have started and I want to push, but I can't until 6 o'clock. I've been waiting since 2 o'clock to do this lecture, so I'm hoping I can get it all out. So I have 5 different things to cover tonight. And we're going to begin with some of the material that I did in the lecture 2 weeks ago, but I want to show you some things and make some emphases here as we start to move through how the writer of the fourth gospel and the 3 letters, the 3 epistles, how that particular writer, editor, evangelist, we'll find out later that it's a group of people that create this gospel, but how they understood Jesus and what's really going on in this gospel. Because we're going to find, first of all, a tremendous amount of congruence with mimetic theory. We're going to find a tremendous amount of congruence with the thesis we established on Paul. We're going to find more ammunition, or we're going to revisit ammunition for the split between certain traditions like Paul and the writer of the fourth gospel and the Jerusalem community. So you have now 2 witnesses that have split with the Jerusalem community in the early church. In order to do that, I have to share my screen. Okay. I have to get out of all my internet stuff here. I need to leave that up. And I need to go to my, turn that down. And we're going to start right here. Now, this is 1 John. And what we have with 1 John is a structure. This is my structure, and the same with the Gospel of John you're going to see next. So this is my material. What I did was I went through and utilizing chiasmus as a possible structure, I then went through each major pericope or paragraph, and I identified, first of all, the key words in the first 4 verses, and I went to the end of the letter, found the same exact verses. Went to the next paragraph, came back, and just kept doing this until I got to the center of the letter, which is 1 John 3:10. So this is known as the A, this is known as the A prime, the B prime. And the thing is, in Greek, all of these words are identical, okay? And I've even put some, left some untranslated in here. But the point is, in 1 John 3:10, you have the center of this letter. And the point of this letter is that there's a distinction between the children of God and the children of the devil. And what the author goes on to do is to identify the children of God as those who care for the physical needs of those in the community. In other words, this love of God or love for God or God's love for us is manifested amongst us when we care for each other, when we care for the poor among us. So there is this ethical piece here to this structure that's absolutely important to understand where the author is going in this little letter. Now, if we juxtapose that with the structure of the gospel itself. Remember, I pointed out that there were 7 signs. The first 2 are numbered. The first, that is, the writer tells you this is the first semia or sign. This is the second. And then you go find the rest. If we take these signs, okay, and we parallel them, we can see that the center of this thing has to do with water, bread, blood, spirit. We're dealing here with sacraments, physical sacraments, okay? And for those of you that are Protestant and don't particularly care for this, try not to imagine that this writer is thinking in some kind of late Thomistic transubstantiation theory. He's not. Okay, what this writer is doing is breaking down the dualistic worldview that was held. the ancient world in captivity, still holds ours in captivity, but definitely there was nothing there until the gospel came on the scene. And he's breaking apart that world. And so each of these particular semia or signs in the fourth gospel has its corresponding discourse. And each one of these has to deal somehow with something related to the sacramental life of the church. What that suggests for me is that the sacramental life of the church and the ethical life of the church are identical. That is, in the sacrament, one recognizes that Jesus comes to us as this victim that's crucified, broken body, broken blood, a broken body, spilled blood. And he also comes to us in baptism with the Spirit. There's your two sacraments. And when you have a letter that has the ethical component of caring for the community and a gospel whose structure shows that the heart of this whole reality of Jesus about the Word becoming flesh, about breaking apart all dualisms, it also means, if this is true sacramentally, it's true ethically. And the problem, if you read the Johannine literature, is that you discover very, very quickly that the writer is writing against those who would deny Jesus has come in the flesh. And we have evidence of this from the Gnostic literature from Nag Hammadi. And so there are any number of Gnostic tractates where Jesus appears to be human, but he's really not human. He's taken on a human disguise, but he's really not human. If in some text the Spirit comes on Jesus, it leaves Jesus at Gethsemane. He's tortured, he's crucified, and the Jesus is crucified, and the Christ Spirit hovers above him laughing because the people think they're killing God. They're not. They can't kill God. They can only kill a person. That's this dualism that permeates the ancient world. Matter is evil, spirit is good. And as we've talked about before, there are two types of Gnostic responses to that. One is to deny the reality of, to say that matter is evil, and thus anything to do with sweat, blood, semen, yada, yada, yada. There's a lot of asceticism. Don't eat this, don't do that, don't get married, bup, bup, bup. And the other is libertinism. If matter is evil and it can't affect spirit, we can do whatever we want. But one thing that Gnosticism can do is it can ignore the poor. It can ignore the hungry. It can ignore those in pain. Because for Gnostics, that isn't real. The real is the spiritual. And so I don't need to feed you if you're hungry. That just meets a physical need. That's not a real need. This author is writing against that. So that's the first thing that I want to show you from the structure. Now, I'm going to remind you again, Birger Gerhardsson, in his great big commentary on the epistles of John, makes an excellent case for reading them backwards than the order we have them. We call them 1 John, 2 John, 3 John. But they were written in that reverse order. They were written 3 John, 2 John, 1 John, and then the gospel. Now, if you follow Raymond Brown in his commentary, it's 1, 2, 3 John, and then the gospel. But by inverting the letters, as Birger Gerhardsson does, you can see the development of a problem in the Johannine community. And you can see what it leads to a split in the community in 1 John. And the writer of 1 John will call these people antichrists, anti-messiahs, false Christ figures. Why? Because they are preaching a Jesus that does not come in the flesh. They're not willing to do that. And we don't know the reasons why, but they weren't willing to do that. Whether they were Jews who felt uncomfortable confessing Jesus' messiahship in the synagogue, or whether we're dealing with Jewish Gnostics, remembering Gnosticism arrives, it develops from Judaism, Samaritanism to be specific. That's where Jewish Christian Gnosticism comes from, right out of Samaritanism. Keeping all of this in mind, when we come to the fourth gospel and we want to ask about who is Jesus in this letter, the one thing we get right away is Jesus is the Word become flesh. Okay? Now it's important. Do I have any of my Greek students in here? I have Tommy. Yeah, okay. It's important here that the writer does not say that Jesus is me, flesh. He says Jesus became, he uses the verb ginomai, to become, becomes flesh. Okay? Now, in the fourth gospel, there's going to be something very interesting that I think will tickle your ears a little bit. When we talk about the incarnation, we are always thinking in terms of Platonic categories. And so when we come to John 1:14, we go, the Word became flesh, God became human. That's what we do. It doesn't say God became human. It said the Word, the Logos, becomes sarx. Okay, it doesn't say God becomes human. And it doesn't say the Word is sarx. It's the Word becomes. Now, the reason I want to emphasize that is we tend to stop right there with incarnation. We go, okay, the Word became flesh, born of a virgin, yada, yada, yada. There's the incarnation. So how do we talk about the humanity and the divinity of Jesus? Is he 100% human and 100% divine? Well, 100 plus 100 is 200, so he can't be 200. So how do we sort this out? Does he have one will or two wills? Is there a human and a divine will? Do they cooperate? How do they cooperate? Whose mind does he have? Does he have a human mind? Does he have God's mind? Does he have split mind? Blah, blah, blah. And this is all the early church Christological debates. They do this for about 500 years. Okay? The writer of the Gospel of John does not perceive incarnation to be just that moment of some kind of divine spark igniting with human DNA in Mary's womb. No. When you get to John chapter 5, after Jesus heals the paralytic, there's a discourse. And in that discourse, it's all about whether or not Jesus violates the Sabbath. But in that discourse, in chapter 5, verse 17, Jesus says, you've got to understand something. My Father is laboring until today, and I am laboring also. Now, when Jesus says, my Father is laboring even until today, what is he saying? God is not finished creating. It's not like there were 6 days and then a Sabbath and God sat and rested. God is still creating. There's the creation process is ongoing even in the life and the ministry of Jesus. And when we get down to chapter 19 in the cross, and the last word of Jesus in the Gospel of John is the perfect tetelestai, it is finished. One has to ask, what is finished? I mean, did Jesus have to hang there for 6 hours for atonement to be done? Couldn't it have been done in 30 seconds? What is it that is indeed completed? The creation. The creation of the perfect representation of God in the physical cosmos is created exactly at the moment of the death of God. That's where the creation is completed. That's also where it's judged, on the cross. Now, we have this judgment themes in several places, but the most, well, I'll read both of them here with you. The first one is this. The one who believes, this is John chapter 12. The one who believes in me does not believe in me, but the one who sent me. And the one who sees me sees the one who sent me. There's that identity we've been talking about all along. I've come as a light into the world so that everyone who trusts me should not remain in darkness. if anyone hears my words and doesn't follow them, I do not judge that one. Listen very carefully. If anyone hears my words and does not obey them or follow them, I do not judge that one. For I have not come to judge the world, but to save the world. The one who rejects me and does not accept my words has a judge already. What is that judge? Is it the Father? Is it the Holy Spirit? No, it's the word I have spoken will judge him at the last day. The message I have brought will be the judge. That is, the message that was rejected will be seen as true, and it will be the judge of the rejection. Not necessarily of the person, but of the rejection. Now, here's also what happens in John chapter 16. When the Spirit is sent, Jesus says, it's to your advantage that I go away, because if I don't go away, the advocate will not come to you. But if I go, I will send him to you. And when he comes, or she, or it, whatever personal pronoun you're comfortable with, or they, I don't know, God didn't exactly inscribe here all the pronouns that she or he or it wants to go by. When he comes, I'm just reading, he will prove the world wrong. That is, when the Spirit comes, the work of the Spirit is to prove the world wrong about three things. The first is sin. The world's going to prove the Spirit's going to prove the world wrong concerning sin. Jesus says, because they do not believe in me. That is, when the world refuses to recognize the character of the benevolent, caring, nurturing Father in Jesus, that's the sin. That's the ultimate sin. And to continue to believe that God is Janus-faced is the ultimate sin. The writer of this has already said this in the letter previously in 1 John. God is light, and in God there is no darkness at all. So to reject that, that's the word that judges. But concerning sin, Jesus says the Spirit will prove the world wrong because they don't believe in me. Concerning righteousness, because I am going to the Father and you will see me no longer. In other words, the Father will vindicate me. I get to go sit at the right hand of God. That's where I'm going. The Father's going to vindicate me. Their concept of righteousness is false. What they thought was right by killing me was a wrong decision. That's not, you understand what I'm saying? And then listen to this third thing. How many of you know off the top of your head what the third thing is? The Spirit will convict, show the world is wrong about sin and righteousness and what else? How many of you know what it is off the top of your head? Judgment. The Spirit will prove the world wrong about judgment, Jesus says, because the ruler of this world has been condemned. That's what's happening on the cross. Jesus is judging sin because they don't believe that he is revealing God, even in that moment of crucifixion, showing the love of the Father by not retaliating, by not becoming some kind of Greek god and wreaking vengeance. Convict of righteousness because they're crucifying an innocent man. And also, like the Pauline tradition, there's a recognition that the prince of this world is being judged on the cross. Where do you find all these themes? Sin, righteousness, and judgment. You find them in the Second Temple apocalyptic judgment scene, like we find in the book of the Revelation, or Matthew, or First Enoch, or the Dead Sea Scrolls. Those three together. At the end of time, God, Israel's God, will come and separate the sheep and the goats in Enoch, the righteous believers from the unrighteous ones, and same thing in Qumran. You have this eschatological separation taking place. Depends on how faithful you were to Torah, and it's very, very clear. And it's all about sin and making sure that you don't have, you have more righteousness than sin, and it's all about judgment. And here, these three themes are deconstructed on the cross. The cross is the end of this kind of Second Temple thinking in the Johannine writer's eyes. And like Paul, this writer does not present Jesus in a Second Temple apocalyptic fashion. One of the things we're going to have to deal with here in the coming months has to do with, with the issue of whether or not the synoptic writers apocalypticized Jesus, and the Johannine writer tends to represent Jesus, quote unquote, more historically, or whether Jesus was actually an apocalyptist like Schweitzer and others thought throughout the 20th century and still do. And the Johannine writer has Hellenized Jesus, turned him into this long-winded discourse type figure. So we're going to have to look at that. But like this writer and like Paul, it's important to recognize that it is the cross where everything happens. For this writer, creation ends at the cross, and resurrection is the new creation. The old creation ends at the cross with the perfect, the only perfect reality in all of creation, the self-giving Jesus as the revelation of the Father. That was the point of creation. It ends right there. God chooses to die rather than judge us and wipe us out of existence. That is an amazing gospel. All right, that's point number one. Jeez. Point number two. This writer is extraordinarily creative. And what I'm about to share with you just is something that I've been reading the Gospel of John in Greek since I'm 19 years old, so that's 45 years. And even today, I was looking up a text, and I'm not kidding you, my mind was blown. I went, man, I've never seen that before. I cannot get enough of this writer, but I want to show you how absolutely clever this writer is. We know that there is a Jesus-Moses parallelism in this gospel. We know that this writer is a highly educated writer in terms of knowledge of Jewish tradition. This writer has more implicit use of Jewish tradition than even Matthew's gospel, which is much more explicit in terms of its offering halakhic formulations and this kind of thing. This writer has hidden subtexts throughout that reference Jewish tradition at one point or another all over the place. My favorite example is, of course, John 7:38-39. On the last and greatest day of the feast, Jesus stood aloud and cried, saying, if anyone is thirsty, let that one come to me and drink. As Scripture has said, rivers of living water will flow from his belly. This he said concerning the Spirit, for the Spirit was not yet, because Jesus had not yet been glorified. In that text, the writer is referencing a whole host of historical and theological themes that go around the Feast of the Tabernacles. And there is so much happening in those little 3 verses. If you're curious, I do have a talk on it somewhere for an hour, where we just unpack all of the various lectionary texts that are used at the Feast of the Tabernacles, the various ceremonies that are happening there, and how this John 7:8 narrative is just illumines, because of this Jewish background, is able to illumine and show that Jesus is in fact the true reason, in this sense, I hate to use this language, is the true reason for the feast, that Jesus is the true light of the world, just as he is the true manna. And of course, we have there the the repetition of the three great events in Moses' life: the manna, the Shekinah glory, that's the Holy Spirit, that's the John 7:37 text, and the Shekinah as the light of the world in John 8. So we have this cluster of Mosaic motifs where Jesus is greater than Moses. And we have this Jesus-Moses parallelism through this gospel because this is a community, like Matthew's community, that is struggling in its identity in relation to Judaism at the end of the first century. Okay, so in both Matthew's gospel and John's gospel, we see this struggle with Judaism in the relationship of Jesus to Moses. In Matthew's gospel, Jesus basically fulfills Moses and thus is greater than Moses. In Luke's gospel, Jesus is the prophet rejected, like Moses was rejected. But in John's gospel, there is a shift in the thinking with regard to Moses, whereas Torah comes through Moses, charis, grace, and truth, aletheia, remembering, come through Jesus. So we have the Jesus-Moses parallelism in the fourth gospel that runs through it. We have reference to any number of festivals in the Gospel of John: Passover, Hanukkah, Tabernacles. I mean, it's a rich gospel in terms of all of this. And the writer is able to use his knowledge of all these traditions and weave together this narrative of how Jesus is the true vine. Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. All of those true texts where Jesus is the I am text. I am this, I am this, I am this. But the writer's also very familiar with the Greek world. And you cannot read the Gospel of John without thinking about Dionysius, especially John chapter 2, the miracle of the turning of the water into wine, because that was the great miracle of the Greek god Dionysius, who was the god of wine, the god of orgy. And orgy is the word for chaos. We call it sexual chaos, but orgy in Greek, orgy also means wrath, chaos, anger, this way. So in John chapter 2, instead, you have this story being told that mirrors a Dionysian miracle, and yet completely is doing something else, because it's done in the context of nuptials, marriage ceremony, rather than a sexual orgy. It's also in this text that Jesus will do his first sign. And in the Gospel of John, when Jesus demonstrates power, it's not called a miracle. It's not called a dunamis. It's called a sign. It in itself, it means nothing. It's pointing to something. And as I showed you in that chart earlier, all these signs in the Johannine Gospel are pointing blood, water, spirit, blood, water, spirit, blood, water, spirit. And when we get to the final sign of John's Gospel, the crucifixion, what is it that we indeed get? Blood, water, spirit. You see, in the Johannine Gospel, the Spirit is given in the crucifixion. When it says he breathed his last, he pneumed his last out. That's where the Spirit is given. In the Johannine Gospel, in order to show that the Spirit was not given at some kind of event, as Luke would record at a Pentecost event, the Spirit's given in the upper room. Jesus says to the disciples, receive the Spirit. What happens at Pentecost is a group of 500 people who receive the Spirit. Now, if in fact the fourth Gospel's narrative of receiving the Spirit is to be connected with the appearance of the risen Jesus in the upper room, it should not surprise us that Luke's narrative of Pentecost, where the disciples are there and all of a sudden, whoosh, they hear the sound, also is a resurrection appearance. The resurrection appearance to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at one time. And that's because there's this singular use of the verb orao in that text in the aorist, opthe, And that's only used of resurrection appearances in that text. The Spirit appeared. That's only used of the resurrected Jesus. I can imagine 500 people seeing the risen Jesus at one time is going to be a different phenomenal experience than 10 or 12 or 15 in an upper room. Okay? Do you understand what I'm saying here? It's also important to remember that even though they had received this Spirit and were still with the risen Jesus after the resurrection, Luke records he teaches them for 40 days. Even though they had the Spirit, they were still stuck in their second temple thinking. Lord, at this time, now, is it time to do the whole restore Israel thing, get rid of the Romans, do the apocalyptic judgment stuff? They had the Spirit, but they didn't get it. Because the work of the Spirit takes time. It would take time. It's taken 2 millennia now. And I'm not even sure we got it. I think we're just dancing around the edges of it. So this writer, and there's, by the way, there's a book I'm reading right now by Dennis MacDonald called The Dionysian Gospel. And one of his arguments is that if you take the Gospel of John, you recognize there are definitely 2 writers. How do we know this? Because the writer of chapter 21 says, I'm the guy that wrote this chapter, and that's not me. I'm talking, there's another guy that wrote the rest of the book. I wrote this chapter. We know there's at least a writer and somebody that adds a chapter. Did that somebody that added that chapter also go through and do editorial work in the gospel before they added that chapter and did the final publication of the gospel? Yes. Can we discern that redactor's hand in the gospel? I think bits and pieces in places you probably can. I'm not one of those that likes to go all out and try to find, 5 different editions of this gospel and all the redactions, the hands that went into it. I think that's a little crazy. But there's definitely 2 writers in this thing. There's a primary text and someone that comes along, edits it for publication and publishes it, no doubt. But one of the things Dennis MacDonald does, he says, when this writer this is his argument, by the way, when the writer sets out to kind of outline the structure of the narrative, he follows Euripides' play, The Bacchae, about Dionysius, the god, and all the chaos that occurs in that play. And I want to read a little bit here to you from that book, because I just find it absolutely fascinating. What did I do with that book? Here it is. Okay. He says, quoting another author here, J.P. Friesen. Both Jesus and Dionysius are the offspring of a divine father and human mother, which was subsequently suspected as a cover-up for illegitimacy. Both are from the East and transfer their cult into Greece as part of its universal expansion. Both bestow wine to their devotees and have wine as a sacred element in their ritual observances. Both had private cults. Both were known for close association with women devotees, and both were subjected to violent deaths and subsequently came back to life. By the middle of the 2nd century, in the early church, observations of such relationships are explicitly made and would later be developed in various directions. So already in the 2nd century, there's these, either from the non-Christian side or the Christian side, a recognition that there's something going on here between Jesus and Dionysius, at least in the 4th gospel. And this is continuing in the remarks by Friesen. A juxtaposition of Jesus and Dionysius is also invited in the Gospel of John, in which the former is credited with a distinctively Dionysian miracle in the wedding at Cana. In the Hellenistic world, there were many myths of Dionysius' miraculous production of wine. And thus, for a polytheistic Greek audience, a Dionysiac resonance in Jesus' wine miracle would have been unmistakable. Jesus employs further Dionysiac imagery when he declares, "I'm the true vine." John's Jesus, presents himself not merely as a new Dionysius, but as one who supplants and replaces him. Now, I think that's very important, because if this writer is able at the same time to use Jewish traditions and this Dionysiac text to create the gospel, it suggests something very important. We got to go back to John 1 for it. In the beginning was what? The Logos. Does that Logos refer to the Hebrew dabar, the word of God, or the Aramaic memra, the memra of God, which is like an intermediary principle in the Targums between humans and God? Could it possibly also reference the Heraclitan logos, which is polemos, war, conflict, violence? Can it reference all three? Is the writer astute enough to recognize that the gospel has to be structured like myth in order to reveal the false character of myth? Now, the early church will recognize the parallels, but we won't be able to come to any firm conclusions until two things. One, 19th century Nietzsche. Nietzsche again raises the Jesus Dionysius comparison in his Antichrist. It's this: the Dionysian god is the god of wrath and freedom and just whatever one wants to do, the Übermensch that will later underpin Nazi thinking. Jesus teaches a slave morality. He teaches people just to be meek and gentle and just go along with the flow, and those humans are weak and deserve to die like Jesus. We ought to be more like Dionysius. He's our God. He's the Rambo God. He's a Rambo God, okay? So if this writer is astute enough to be able to recognize that religion is religion, he's doing with his text what Girard would do later, when Girard would begin to say, if you take the gospel and you look at the gospel in terms of ancient myth, there are several things that one finds in both, including false accusations, trials, torture, and death of one, because it's better that one should die than that the whole structure come tumbling down. And that's what mythology does. It upholds the structure's justification of getting rid of certain peoples or groups in order to keep the structure intact. That is, the gospel reveals the scapegoat mechanism. As myth hides it, the gospel reveals it. That's the power of the gospel. That's what the gospel does. It shows us who we really are. We are the killers of God. We are the killers of the one who creates us. That's what the gospel does. And it also announces forgiveness and everything else. But on an anthropological level, it reveals us for who we are. Now, there is a book. There's actually 3 books I'll talk about tonight, but there's an excellent book. And I don't mean when I share a book with you, some of you go out and buy it right away. That's great. You're going to love them. But I recommend them because I hope some of you will read it. But there's a number of books on the Gospel of John. They're very, very important. But there are some that are important to me that have really helped me. And there's one here by Helen Orchard called Courting Betrayal. And while she never references mimetic theory at all, in this particular book, it is absolutely astonishing how much mimetic theory there is in her reading of the Gospel of John as a biblical scholar. I think this was her PhD. And so I do want to recommend this as a way, if you're familiar with mimetic theory, of seeing this play out in this particular book. So if I read this gospel correctly, what I'm reading is a writer who's taking all world history, the Judaism he comes out of, and now the Hellenistic environment in which he lives. He's taking this whole world and he's showing it for what it is in light of the cross. Fundamentally, there's no difference between Jews and Gentiles when it comes to rejecting the message of the gospel, because both are fundamental, they're religious creatures. And so if you reject violence, if you reject a violent God, if you reject a God that comes at the end of time and weighs things out and brings judgment, if you reject that God, you're rejecting everything about yourself and the culture that you grew up in, that you were raised in, that you were taught. You're rejecting all of that. You will become a pariah. Your families will disown you. Well, does Jesus not talk about in the Synoptic Gospels? And does this writer in this gospel not say, they're going to hate you so much they'll drag you before synagogues and authorities? Sure. Like the Synoptic Gospels, like Paul, this gospel too is very, very clear that to follow Jesus will entail social crises for you. If you follow Jesus and you take him seriously and you're willing to name him as the nonviolent expression of the nonviolent God, you will suffer. I can't tell you how many people I know that have said to me these last years, you know, Michael, when I started believing in a loving God, my family rejected me, my friends defriended me on Facebook, and so forth and so on and so forth. And yet, that's the point here. We are called to be like Jesus. Now, there's a text I want to read you. I have it in my notes here. From Helen Orchard's book, 198. I ran out of Post-it notes. And she makes this observation following Robert Karras, who wrote a book, Jesus and the Marginalized, a real thin paperback. And in that book, Karras argues that the stories in the Gospel of John with regard to the marginalized have a twofold purpose. They demonstrate to the Johannine community the nature of the Messiah Jesus. And secondly, they serve as paradigms of behavior for the persecuted members of the community. How are members of the community to respond when they're persecuted? How? And she goes on to note, the interplay between the text and the community means that the reverse is also the case. The nature of the community is reflected in the picture of their Messiah. And the behavior of the community serves as a paradigm for the stories within the narrative. You can't separate Jesus and the church. This is something we'll be talking about in November. But she quotes David Auna, who says, the character and function of Jesus is identical with the character and function of the followers of Jesus. And this is just another little linchpin, another little piece to add to that larger equation we've been developing, that there is this decay in the early church that gets passed on, that has to do with being forgiving, non-retaliatory, and all of that, loving each other. And in this case, in the fourth gospel, we don't have the love command, love the Lord your God and love your neighbor. It's not a social program. In this community, it's about learning to love each other, practicing together what we're going to be in the future. For the Johannine community, is the church, is humanity that's living eschatologically. They're living now as they live then. How are we going to live then? We're going to take care of one another. We're going to love one another. There will only be forgiveness. There will only be peace between us. So if we live now as we're going to live then, we're going to be those who are going to gather around a scapegoat God, who is the last scapegoat, who ends the scapegoating process, who forgives everyone all their sins. If God forgives everybody all their sins, who are we to hold sins against people? And if in fact the second temple eschatological judgment scene is done away within the cross because the work of the Spirit is to convict the cosmos about how it thinks about sin, righteousness, and judgment, my God, if there was ever a deconstruction of evangelicalism taking place on the cross, it's in this text. Catholicism as well. It's stunning. Absolutely stunning what this writer's doing in this text. Okay, last point. If in fact there's a Jesus-Moses parallelism, we would expect to also see a Johannine community, Jerusalem community parallelism as well, because the Jerusalem community was the community that followed Moses. And we do. As I observed 2 weeks ago, there are 5 places in the gospel where the beloved or other disciple is mentioned. And in every single one of those places, the beloved disciple or the other disciple outranks or bests Peter, makes Peter always comes in second place. The first times in John 1, it's the other disciple and Andrew, Peter's brother, who are with Jesus, and then they go tell Peter. So the beloved disciple meets Jesus first, Peter second. In John 13, it's the beloved disciple who is at Jesus, is at the position of honor. They're at the table with Jesus, not Peter. In the account of the trial, it's the beloved disciple who can enter into the high priest's house. By the way, and not Peter, what does that tell you about this figure? It tells you, number one, he's a priest. Number two, he's a priest with some authority because he has access to the high priest's house before holy days. You know, that's like trying to get into the CEO's office the day before the board of directors meet. You have to have some clout. Okay? The same type of sequence also occurs in John 19. It is the beloved disciple, not Peter at the cross. And then again in John 21, in the boat, Jesus is cooking fish on the shore. It's the beloved disciple that recognizes Jesus, jumps in the water, swims to shore, and then Peter follows him. So there's a definite beloved disciple, Peter parallelism in this gospel. And just as Torah came through Moses and grace and truth came through Jesus, real Jesus authority comes not through the Petrine, James, Jerusalem church tradition, but through the Johannine tradition. That's one of the things this author is doing, arguing against this portrayal of Jesus as a second temple apocalyptic figure. Same exact thing that happened to the Apostle Paul when he changed his thinking from Thessalonians to the later literature. Okay? Same exact thing. Paul and the writer of the fourth gospel give us the exact same argument with regard to the cross. It deconstructs the pillars of religion and culture, and they both give us the same view of the historical Jesus. It's not that Paul doesn't know stories about Jesus. He doesn't need to reference them in his letters. But even the writer of this gospel will tell you, oh, Jesus did so many things, books could be written about it. I'm just going to pick these 7. And for a reason. Because they're important in terms of how he sees the work of Jesus in the world. So I'm now going to give you my personal speculation with regard to the author of the fourth gospel and why there are ways that I seriously deviate from New Testament scholarship at this point. First, the fourth gospel, in my view, could not have been written by the son of Zebedee. Pearson Parker, many years ago, 50 years ago, wrote a brilliant essay, very short essay, in which he enumerated 18 different reasons why the writer of the fourth gospel could in no way be the son of Zebedee, and I think did a brilliant job, and thus destroyed Westcott's thesis that the writer of the fourth gospel was the son of Zebedee. Who then is this writer? Well, one, we know he's a priest. We do know that because he has access to the high priest's household. Two, he's well educated because he's familiar with an awful lot of esoteric Jewish traditions and Jewish law. And three, he's obviously acquainted with Greek culture. So we know this writer's educated. We know that there is a rivalry between this writer and the Petrine community. Who is this beloved disciple or other disciple? Who is this figure that remains unnamed in the text? And why does this figure remain unnamed? There's only one person in John's gospel of whom it is said he loved, and that's Lazarus. But don't say Lazarus, say Eleazar. Eleazar, which is a very, very popular name for priests. Eleazar has two sisters, Mary and Martha. And when Jesus comes to Jerusalem, you'll notice that he always goes and stays with them in Bethany, and he doesn't bring the disciples or the other apostles. He doesn't bring them. He comes there. It is my thought that the Mary, Martha, Lazarus home was Jesus' home away from home. It was his respite where he could be himself, as it were. Now, all of you know that when you talk to the general public, when you present yourself to the general public, you talk a certain way, you give off a certain persona. But when you're with your intimates, when you're with people you trust 100%, you talk differently, right? Scholars have often puzzled as to why the Johannine Jesus sounds so different than the Synoptic Jesus. I'm not saying that the Johannine writer is recording sayings and discourses of Jesus. I'm not saying that at all. But I'm saying that Jesus could be with this family, and they could understand Jesus as he was communicating apart from all this Hanukkah language that he has to use when he's in Galilee. Because when he's in Galilee, he can't just come there and say, oh, you've got a Second Temple Hanukkah worldview, it's all stupid. He can't do that. He has to enter into their language system, into their theological model, and use that to judge them, and he does. For example, when he says it's better to go into the kingdom maimed than it is to be whole in this life, he has to be addressing priests at that point. Do any of you remember that exegesis from the Jesus-driven life? Okay, well, the point I'm trying to make here is that this writer is a priest, understands the Lazarus is from a priestly family. Lazarus is a Levite and is well educated. Now, the reason historical scholarship can't say Lazarus wrote the fourth gospel is because they don't believe in a resurrection from the dead. If you can accept that Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, it's very easy to see this figure behind the fourth gospel. But why does this writer go unnamed in this text? Why is he out there as this little kind of anonymous figure? Okay. It says in John 11 that Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin and the Pharisees were together, and they, at that point, started the plot to kill Jesus. And they record something you don't find in the Synoptic Gospels. They also concocted the plot to kill Lazarus. Dude had just been raised from the dead, and they're going to kill him, you know? What does a person do when there's a plot on their life? They go into witness protection. which is what this family will end up doing. And he will take another name. What name does he pick? See, Anthony, what name does he pick? Johannes. And so when you get to the tradition in the later first century in the early church recorded by Papias, who talks about the elder John in Ephesus. And then he talks about another John. There are two Johns in Ephesus. And scholars have perplexed for an awful long time about this. I just simply want to propose to you that one of those Johns was Eleazar, the evangelist behind the fourth gospel. So there's a lot that can be made sense of with this larger hypothesis, including being able to put to rest any notion that the fourth gospel presents a divine Jesus as opposed to a human Jesus like Casamon argued. We can certainly put to rest in this gospel that the writer is naive and uses simple language, and it's a simple gospel. It is the most complex text ever written, ever written. There are more things going on in this text, subtle and underneath the surface. And the more you learn about Judaism and the more you learn about the Greco-Roman world, the more you begin to see how this writer's engaging that, because it is the purpose of the narrative of the gospel, the story of the gospel, to deconstruct the great lie that we humans have created about the state and religion and culture and ourselves and morality and law and judgment and everything else. That's all human construct. And the cross kills it all. And for that, we have Paul and this writer to thank for opening our eyes to that. And later now, René Girard for being able to pick that up and begin to show how the gospel and myth are identical instruction. In order for the gospel to deconstruct myth, to show it for what it is, it has to be. Just like our ritual involves blood. But instead of the blood of Abel, which calls for vengeance, or the blood of Dionysius, which calls for wrath, we have the blood of forgiveness. And instead of prohibition, we have command. Love one another. One command. Love one another as I have loved you. So gospel replaces myth. The Eucharist replaces any ritual which is death dealing. And command to love replaces prohibition. And the three pillars of culture are now deconstructed in the new community whose identity is in Jesus, who look like him because they follow this ethical pattern. They live this life. They care for each other. They care about their brothers and sisters in the flesh. They are the ones who reveal the Spirit to the world. And so, like I said, either last week or the week before, just as Jesus reveals the Father, we by the Spirit reveal Jesus. And that, my friends, is nothing but good news.